Noble Love in Hard Times. Chapter 1. The Fallen House. The morning mist clung to the grounds of Pemberton Hall like a shroud, obscuring the neglected hedgerows and overgrown gardens that had once been the pride of Yorkshire. Lady Isabella Pemberton stood at the tall windows of the morning room, her slender fingers tracing the condensation on the glass as she gazed upon the crumbling grandeur of her ancestral home. The window panes themselves bore hairline cracks, and she could feel the autumn chill seeping through the ill-fitting frames, yet another repair they could not afford. Behind her, the room told the story of their decline in silent testimony. Pale rectangles on the faded wallpaper marked where ancestral portraits had once hung, sold 2 winters past to keep the creditors at bay. The mahogany furniture that remained bore the scars of hasty removal scratches where precious silver had been dragged away, empty spaces where porcelain had graced the mantelpiece for generations. Even the Persian carpet beneath her feet showed threadbare patches, though Isabella had arranged the remaining furniture to conceal the worst of it. "Isabella, my dear, you must come away from that window. The morning air will give you a chill." Lady Catherine Pemberton's voice carried the practiced composure of a woman who had learned to maintain dignity even as her world crumbled around her. She entered the room with the same regal bearing that had once commanded respect in London's finest drawing rooms, though her morning dress, while impeccably maintained, was 3 seasons out of fashion. Her graying hair was arranged with meticulous care, but Isabella noticed how her mother's hands trembled slightly as she set down the morning's correspondence on the scarred writing desk. "More letters from creditors, Mamma?" Isabella asked, though she already knew the answer. The familiar cream-colored paper of their solicitor's office lay among the pile, along with several others bearing the sharp, urgent script of men demanding payment. "Mr. Blackwood has sent word that we have until Christmas to settle the outstanding debts, or—" Lady Catherine's voice faltered for a moment before she recovered her composure. "Or Pemberton Hall must be sold to satisfy our obligations." Isabella closed her eyes, feeling the weight of 6 centuries of Pemberton history pressing upon her shoulders. Through these very windows her ancestors had watched the Wars of the Roses unfold across the Yorkshire countryside. In this house they had entertained kings and plotted the rise and fall of ministers. The blood of crusaders and courtiers flowed in her veins, and yet none of their noble heritage could forestall the mundane reality of unpaid bills and mounting interest. "How much do we owe?" she asked, turning from the window to face her mother directly. Lady Catherine's composure cracked slightly. "Nearly £8,000, my dear. Your father's investments, the losses at the gaming tables, and now, with the rents so low and half our tenants unable to pay—" She trailed off, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief that had been darned so often it resembled lacework. £8,000. The sum was staggering, more than many families saw in a lifetime, and yet Isabella felt a strange sense of relief at finally knowing the precise dimensions of their catastrophe. She had suspected the worst for months, watching her father retreat further into his study with each passing day, emerging only to stare hollow-eyed at the breakfast table before disappearing again behind his newspapers and brandy. "Where is Papa now?" she inquired, though she suspected she knew. "In his study. He has been there since dawn, going through the estate books again, as if staring at the numbers might somehow change them." The bitterness in her mother's voice was carefully controlled, but Isabella heard it nonetheless. Lord Edmund Pemberton had once been the pride of Yorkshire society, a man whose opinion on politics could sway votes in Parliament, whose approval could make or break a young man's career. Now he was a shadow of his former self, broken by the realization that his name, no matter how ancient, could not conjure money from thin air or restore fortunes lost to poor judgment and worse luck. Isabella moved to the writing desk and sorted through the morning's correspondence with practiced efficiency. Bills from the coal merchant, the grocer, the seamstress. A polite but firm reminder from their last remaining servant that her wages were 6 weeks in arrears. And there, Beneath it all, a single letter that made her pause. The paper was of exceptional quality, cream-colored and heavy, with an elegant watermark visible when held to the light. The seal was unfamiliar, not one of their usual correspondence, and the handwriting was strong and confident. Isabella broke the wax carefully and unfolded the letter, her eyes widening as she read. "Mama," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the racing of her heart. "We may have received an answer to our prayers." Lady Catherine looked up sharply from her own correspondence. "What did you mean, child?" Isabella held up the letter, reading aloud. "Lord Pemberton, I have the honor to request a private audience with your family at your earliest convenience to discuss a matter of mutual benefit. I am given to understand that an advantageous arrangement might be reached between our families, one that would serve the interests of both parties admirably. It is signed by one Samuel Whitmore, Esquire, of Whitmore and Associates, Manchester." "Whitmore?" Lady Catherine frowned, searching her memory. "I know of no family by that name in our circle." "Nor I," Isabella admitted. "But the letter suggests he wishes to discuss some form of arrangement. And given our circumstances, Mama, I believe we cannot afford to ignore any opportunity, no matter its source." As she spoke these words, Isabella felt something hardening within her chest. A crystalline resolve that would have been foreign to the sheltered girl she had been just months before. The luxury of choosing one's associations was a privilege she could no longer afford. If this Mr. Whitmore represented a path away from debtor's prison and social ruin, then she would walk it, regardless of where it might lead. Outside, the morning mist was beginning to lift, revealing the full extent of Pemberton Hall's decay. But inside the morning room, Lady Isabella Pemberton was discovering reserves of strength she had never known she possessed, and preparing to do whatever duty demanded, even if it meant sacrificing her own happiness for the sake of her family's survival. Chapter 2. The Proposal. 3 days later, the sound of well-maintained carriage wheels on gravel announced the arrival of the Whitmore party at Pemberton Hall. Isabella watched from the drawing-room window as a magnificent black carriage, pulled by 4 perfectly matched bay horses, came to a stop before their front steps. The vehicle bore no coat of arms, but its craftsmanship spoke of considerable wealth, the kind of wealth that came from industry rather than inheritance. "They have arrived," she announced to her parents, who sat rigidly in the room's remaining chairs. Lord Edmund had emerged from his study for the occasion, though he looked as if he would rather face a firing squad than these unknown visitors. His once proud bearing seemed permanently stooped now, and his fingers trembled slightly as he adjusted his cravat. The carriage door opened, and a portly gentleman in his 50s descended first. Samuel Whitmore was everything Isabella had expected from a Manchester merchant, prosperous, but lacking the effortless elegance that marked true breeding. His clothes were expensive but somehow too new, too carefully chosen. His movements spoke of a man more comfortable in counting houses than drawing rooms, but it was the second figure who commanded Isabella's attention. Thomas Whitmore stepped down from the carriage with an easy grace that surprised her, his tall frame unfolding with natural elegance. Where his father's wealth announced itself through obvious displays, the younger Whitmore's prosperity was more subtle, evident in the perfect cut of his coat, the quality of his boots, the confident way he surveyed their ancestral home without the tourist's gaping wonder she had expected. "He is not what I anticipated," Lady Catherine murmured, clearly sharing Isabella's surprise. Indeed, Thomas Whitmore possessed a refinement that seemed at odds with his merchant origins. His dark hair was fashionably styled, his features were strong and intelligent, and when he looked up at the house, Isabella caught a glimpse of eyes that held both determination and something softer, a quality she could not quite identify. "Nor I," Isabella admitted, though she quickly schooled her expression into one of cool composure. Whatever his appearance, he remained a tradesman's son, and she would not forget the vast gulf that separated their stations. Mrs. Hartwell, their sole remaining servant, announced the visitors with all the dignity she could muster, despite her worn dress and anxious expression. The drawing-room, hastily rearranged to hide the worst evidence of their reduced circumstances, felt suddenly smaller as the two men entered. Samuel Whitmore's bow was correct, but carried the slight stiffness of a man unaccustomed to such formal courtesies. Lord Pemberton, Lady Catherine, Lady Isabella, I am deeply honored by your gracious reception. Lord Edmund rose with effort, his voice carrying an echo of his former authority. Mr. Whitmore, your letter intrigued us. Please, be seated. As the men settled themselves, Isabella observed Thomas Whitmore with covert attention. Unlike his father, who perched somewhat awkwardly on the edge of his chair, Thomas appeared perfectly at ease. His gaze moved around the room with appreciation rather than calculation, and when it briefly met hers, she felt an unexpected flutter of something. Not attraction, surely. Mere curiosity about this unexpected refinement in a merchant's son. I shall speak plainly, Lord Pemberton, Samuel Whitmore began, his Manchester accent more pronounced now than it had seemed in the entrance hall. I am a businessman, and I believe in direct dealing. I understand your family faces certain financial difficulties. Lady Catherine's sharp intake of breath was audible, but Lord Edmund merely nodded wearily. Indeed, though I confess myself puzzled as to how this concerns you, sir, because I believe we might arrange something beneficial to both our families. Samuel's eyes moved to Isabella. My son Thomas requires a wife of proper breeding, one who can provide him with the social connections that money cannot buy. Your daughter requires, well, let us say she requires a settlement that would alleviate your current difficulties. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Isabella felt her cheeks burn with humiliation at having their poverty discussed so baldly, yet she forced herself to remain still and silent. This was the reality of their situation. They had nothing left to bargain with, except her bloodline and her beauty. Thomas Whitmore had said nothing throughout his father's speech, but Isabella was acutely aware of his attention focused upon her. When she finally looked directly at him, she was startled by the intensity of his gaze. There was nothing calculating in his expression. Instead, she saw something that looked remarkably like wonder. The settlement I propose, Samuel continued, would be sufficient to discharge all debts against the Pemberton estate, with a considerable sum remaining for its restoration and maintenance. In return, my son would gain a wife whose breeding and connections would open doors that remain closed to men of commerce, regardless of their wealth. And what? Isabella found herself asking, her voice steady despite the tumult in her chest. Does your son think of this arrangement? For the first time, Thomas Whitmore spoke. His voice was cultured, with only the faintest trace of northern inflection. I think, Lady Isabella, that any man would count himself fortunate to win your hand, regardless of the circumstances. There was something in his tone, a warmth, a sincerity, that caught her off guard. She had expected either mercenary calculation or embarrassed reluctance. Instead, she heard something that sounded almost like admiration. You speak as though you know me, sir, she replied coolly, reasserting her composure. We have never met. A slight smile touched Thomas's lips. No, we have not. But I have heard of your reputation for intelligence and grace. And now, having met you, he paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. Now I believe those reports to be woefully inadequate. The compliment was smoothly delivered, but Isabella sensed genuine feeling beneath the polished words. It unsettled her more than crude flattery would have. She had prepared herself to deal with a fortune-hunting merchant's son, motivated purely by social ambition. She had not prepared for someone who looked at her as though she were something precious, rather than merely advantageous. The terms would be generous, Samuel Whitmore pressed on, apparently satisfied with his son's performance. £10,000 upon the engagement, with additional provisions for the estate's ongoing maintenance. A London house for the couple, and of course, Lady Isabella would want for nothing. £10,000, more than enough to satisfy their creditors with money to spare. Isabella felt the weight of her family's expectations, her duty to salvage what she could from their ruin. Yet something in Thomas Whitmore's continued gaze made her feel as though she were betraying not just herself, but him as well, by reducing their potential union to mere financial terms. "This is most generous," Lord Edmund managed, his voice thick with emotion. "Might we have some time to consider your proposal?" "Of course," Samuel replied, "though I hope you will not delay overlong. My son is quite eager to proceed, and there are other considerations." "Other considerations?" Lady Catherine inquired sharply. Thomas Whitmore straightened slightly. "What my father means to say is that I am not growing any younger, and I have reached an age where marriage has become advisable. I had hoped to find a wife who could be a true partner, not merely an ornament or a convenience." Again, that direct gaze, as though he were speaking to Isabella alone. She found herself studying his face, noting the intelligence in his dark eyes, the strength in his jaw, the way his mouth curved slightly upward even in repose. Against her will, she had to admit that he was undeniably handsome. More troubling still was the growing suspicion that his interest in her extended far beyond mere social advancement. When the Whitmores finally took their leave, with promises to await the Pemberton family's decision within the week, Isabella remained at the drawing-room window, watching their carriage disappear down the drive. "Well?" Lady Catherine asked anxiously. "What do you think of them?" Isabella continued staring out at the empty drive, her mind churning with conflicting thoughts. "I think," she said finally, "that Mr. Thomas Whitmore is not at all what I expected a merchant's son to be." "And is that a good thing or a bad thing, my dear?" Isabella turned from the window, her expression composed, but her eyes betraying a hint of uncertainty. "I honestly do not know, Mamma. I honestly do not know." But even as she spoke these words, she could not shake the memory of how Thomas Whitmore had looked at her, not as a transaction to be completed or a prize to be won, but as a woman worthy of something that looked remarkably like devotion. Chapter 3. The Cold Union. The wedding of Lady Isabella Pemberton to Mr. Thomas Whitmore took place on a crisp December morning in 1847, in the hallowed halls of St. George's Church, Hanover Square. The fashionable London church, where so many of society's most prominent unions had been celebrated, witnessed an unusual spectacle that morning: the marriage of ancient bloodline to modern commerce, orchestrated with all the pomp that Whitmore money could provide. Isabella stood before the altar in a gown of ivory silk that had cost more than most families earned in a year, its intricate Brussels lace and seed-pearl embellishments a testament to her new husband's prosperity. The dress had been Thomas's gift to her, presented with such genuine pleasure in her reaction that she had felt momentarily guilty for accepting it with mere politeness rather than gratitude. Even now, as she spoke her vows in a clear, steady voice, she could feel the weight of the sapphire and diamond necklace at her throat, another gift from the Whitmore family coffers. The pews were filled with an intriguing mixture of guests. On the bride's side sat the remnants of Yorkshire and London society lords, and ladies whose own fortunes might be precarious, but whose bloodlines remained unquestioned. They watched the proceedings with expressions ranging from approval to barely concealed disdain, depending on their own circumstances and prejudices. On the groom's side, a different sort of prosperity was represented. Merchants, industrialists, and their families, dressed in the finest clothes money could buy, but lacking the effortless elegance that marked true breeding. "I, Thomas Edward Whitmore, take thee, Isabella Catherine Pemberton, to be my wedded wife." Isabella listened to her husband's voice, how strange that word felt, even in her thoughts, as he spoke his vows with unmistakable sincerity. His hand holding hers was warm and steady, and when she dared to glance at his face, she saw an expression of such genuine joy that it made her chest tighten with an emotion she refused to examine. He was getting what he wanted, she reminded herself firmly. A wife who would open the doors of society to him. Nothing more. When it came time for her own vows, Isabella spoke each word with perfect composure, her voice carrying clearly through the church. She had practiced this moment in her mind countless times, preparing herself to fulfill her role with dignity and grace. She was a Pemberton, and Pembertons had always done their duty, regardless of personal cost. "You may kiss the bride." Thomas's hands were gentle as he lifted her veil, and for a moment their eyes met directly. In his gaze she saw not triumph or satisfaction, but something that looked remarkably like tenderness. When his lips touched hers briefly, respectfully, she felt an unexpected warmth that had nothing to do with the December chill that pervaded the ancient church. The wedding breakfast that followed was held at Claridge's Hotel, another expense that showcased the Whitmore family's determination to do things properly. Isabella moved through the receiving line with practiced grace, accepting congratulations from guests whose names and faces blurred together in a parade of polite society. She smiled when appropriate, made the expected small talk, and played her part as the radiant bride to perfection. "You look beautiful, my dear," Lady Catherine whispered during a brief moment when they found themselves together, "and happy." "Do I?" Isabella replied quietly, touching the sapphires at her throat. "I suppose that is what is expected." Her mother's eyes searched her face with concern. "Isabella, you are not merely playing a role anymore. This is your life now." Before Isabella could respond, Thomas appeared at her elbow with 2 glasses of champagne. "Ladies, might I steal my wife away for a moment? There are some people I should like her to meet." Wife. The word still felt foreign, like a garment that did not quite fit properly. Isabella allowed herself to be led across the room to where a small group of well-dressed individuals waited with expectant smiles. "Isabella, may I present my sister Margaret and my mother, Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore." Margaret Whitmore was perhaps 20, with her brother's dark hair and intelligent eyes, though her manner was more openly warm than Thomas's careful politeness. She stepped forward with genuine enthusiasm, taking Isabella's hands in hers. "Oh, Isabella, may I call you Isabella? I am so delighted to have a sister at last. Thomas has spoken of little else since your engagement was announced." "Has he?" Isabella replied, allowing a note of surprise to enter her voice as she glanced at her husband. A faint color rose in his cheeks. "Margaret has a tendency toward exaggeration," Thomas said mildly, though his eyes held a hint of amusement. Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore was a handsome woman in her 50s, dressed with impeccable taste, but somehow still radiating the air of someone unused to such grand occasions. Her smile was polite but cautious as she curtsied to Isabella. "Lady Isabella, I hope you will be very happy in our family. I know it must be an adjustment for someone of your background." The words were carefully chosen, but Isabella detected the underlying uncertainty. Mrs. Whitmore was as uncomfortable with this alliance as Isabella herself, though for different reasons. Where Isabella felt she was lowering herself, Thomas's mother clearly feared that her family was reaching above their proper station. "I am sure we shall all adjust admirably," Isabella replied with cool courtesy. "After all, marriage requires adaptation from all parties involved." She saw Thomas glance at her sharply, perhaps detecting the subtle distance in her tone, but before he could speak, other guests claimed their attention, and the moment passed. The remainder of the day proceeded with clockwork precision. Speeches were made praising the happy couple and the beneficial union of their families. Toasts were raised to prosperity and happiness. The 3-tiered wedding cake was cut with appropriate ceremony. and Thomas's hand covered hers on the silver knife handle with what felt like protective tenderness. Through it all, Isabella maintained her composure perfectly. She was gracious to the Whitmore family connections, charming to the society guests who had come to witness this unusual match, and appropriately affectionate toward her new husband. If anyone noticed that her smiles never quite reached her eyes, or that she held herself with the rigid control of someone playing a demanding role, they were too polite to comment. As evening approached and the time came for the couple to depart for their wedding journey, a week in Brighton, another of Thomas's carefully considerate arrangements, Isabella found herself in the hotel's elegant ladies' retiring room, adjusting her traveling dress and preparing for the next phase of her new life. "Are you quite well, my lady?" asked Mary, the lady's maid Thomas had engaged for her as yet another wedding gift. The girl was young and eager to please, clearly overwhelmed by the prospect of serving a real lady. "Perfectly well, Mary, thank you." But as Isabella studied her reflection in the mirror, she wondered if that was entirely true. The woman looking back at her wore an expensive dress and valuable jewels, and bore the name of a prosperous merchant's wife. She looked every inch the successful bride. Yet behind her composed expression lay a growing unease, not about her circumstances, which were far better than she had dared hope, but about the man she had married. Thomas Whitmore was proving to be far more complex than she had anticipated. His consideration for her comfort, his obvious pride in her company, the way his eyes followed her throughout the day with something that looked remarkably like genuine affection. All of it unsettled her carefully constructed emotional barriers. She had prepared herself to marry a social climber who saw her as a stepping stone to respectability. She had not prepared for someone who seemed to value her for herself, who looked at her as though she were something precious rather than merely useful. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Isabella, are you ready? The carriage is waiting." Thomas's voice carried through the door, patient and gentle. She took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and prepared to join him. She was Mrs. Thomas Whitmore now, whatever that might mean, and if her husband's apparent genuine regard for her complicated her feelings about their arrangement, well, she would simply have to guard against such complications more carefully. After all, she reminded herself as she opened the door to find Thomas waiting, with an expression of such warm anticipation that it made her breath catch. This was a business arrangement, nothing more. The fact that he seemed to have forgotten that unfortunate detail was his concern, not hers. She would not allow herself to forget it. Chapter 4. Clashing Worlds. The Whitmore townhouse in Belgravia stood as a testament to ambitious prosperity, its pristine Georgian facade and perfectly manicured front garden announcing to all of London that its owners had arrived, if not in bloodline, then certainly in fortune. Isabella stood in the marble-floored entrance hall on a gray February morning, watching Thomas adjust his greatcoat before departing for his offices in the city. 2 months of marriage had settled into a routine that was both comfortable and deeply unsettling. "I should be home by 6, Thomas said, pausing to kiss her cheek with the same gentle courtesy he had shown since their wedding night. "Margaret mentioned she might call this afternoon. I hope you don't mind the company." "Of course not," Isabella replied, though she still felt uncertain about her sister-in-law's enthusiastic attempts at friendship. Margaret's warmth was genuine, but overwhelming to someone raised in the cooler emotional climate of aristocratic reserve. Thomas hesitated at the door, his dark eyes studying her face with an expression she had learned to recognize, a mixture of hope and careful restraint. "The Ashfords have invited us to dinner Thursday next. Lord Ashford mentioned his interest in discussing some shipping investments, and I thought, that is, your connections have been invaluable in opening such opportunities." There it was again, the delicate balance they maintained. Thomas needed her social connections to advance his business interests, yet he approached the subject with such obvious reluctance to treat her as merely useful that it made Isabella's carefully constructed defenses waver. "I shall write to Lady Ashford this morning," she assured him. "Lord Ashford has always been astute in his investments. You will find him a valuable associate." "Thank you." Thomas's smile was warm with genuine gratitude. "I don't know what I would do without your guidance in navigating these waters." After he departed, Isabella found herself alone in the opulent drawing-room, surrounded by furnishings that spoke of wealth, but somehow lacked the patina of generations that marked true aristocratic homes. Everything was beautiful, expensive, and slightly too new. Like her marriage, she thought, with uncomfortable honesty. The morning's correspondence brought the usual mixture of social invitations and business communications forwarded from Thomas's offices. She had become adept at managing both, using her social knowledge to identify which invitations would benefit his commercial interests, while maintaining the delicate fiction that their attendance was motivated purely by pleasure. "My lady," Mrs. Patterson, the housekeeper, appeared in the doorway with the quiet efficiency that marked the best servants. The entire household ran with clockwork precision, another reflection of Thomas's methodical approach to everything in his life. "Yes, Mrs. Patterson?" "There's a caller, my lady. Lady Pembroke. She's waiting in the morning room." Isabella's pulse quickened. Lady Pembroke was one of society's most influential hostesses, a woman whose approval or disapproval could make or break a family's social standing. They had met briefly at the Ashfords' Christmas party, where Lady Pembroke had been politely cool, but not openly dismissive. She found her visitor examining the portrait above the mantelpiece, a recent commission showing Isabella in her wedding gown, painted by one of London's most fashionable artists. Another of Thomas's gifts, presented with such pride in her beauty that she had been momentarily speechless. "Lady Pembroke, what an unexpected pleasure." The older woman turned with a smile that was both gracious and calculating. "My dear Mrs. Whitmore, I do hope I may call you that now. I felt it was time we became better acquainted. Your marriage caused quite a stir in certain circles." Isabella gestured toward the tea service that Mrs. Patterson had efficiently prepared. "I hope not an unwelcome stir." "Oh, my dear, change is never entirely welcome to those who have grown comfortable with existing arrangements. But tell me, how are you finding married life? It must be quite different from what you knew before." The words were carefully chosen, but Isabella heard the probing beneath them. Lady Pembroke was fishing for information about the state of her marriage, the success of the social experiment that was a Pemberton-Whitmore alliance. "Marriage always requires adjustment," Isabella replied diplomatically. "But I find my husband most considerate." "Indeed, and he is prospering, I understand. Lord Ashford speaks highly of his business acumen. Thomas is very dedicated to his work." "Dedicated, yes. One notices such things. He seems to work quite long hours." Lady Pembroke's tone was delicately probing. "I do hope this doesn't leave you feeling neglected." Isabella felt a flash of irritation at the woman's transparent attempt to discover whether the marriage was merely a business arrangement or something more substantial. "On the contrary, I admire his industriousness. There is something refreshing about a man who takes his responsibilities seriously." It was true, she realized, with some surprise. During these months of marriage, she had come to respect Thomas's work ethic, his genuine care for his employees, his methodical approach to building something lasting rather than simply accumulating wealth for its own sake. "How modern of you," Lady Pembroke murmured. "And you've been assisting him, I hear. Quite the devoted wife." The subtle barb hit its mark. In traditional aristocratic marriages, wives might manage households and social calendars, but they did not involve themselves in their husbands' commercial enterprises. Isabella's active participation in furthering Thomas's business connections marked her as something different, though whether that difference was admirable or scandalous remained to be seen. "I believe marriage should be a partnership," Isabella said carefully. each spouse contributing what they can to the success of the whole. Lady Pembroke's eyebrows rose slightly. How very practical. I confess, I had wondered whether you might find the transition from Pemberton Hall to this rather difficult. Isabella's training in diplomatic conversation served her well. Every home has its own character. I find this one quite charming. But after Lady Pembroke departed with promises to include the Whitmores in her upcoming soirée, Isabella found herself wandering through the house with new eyes. The drawing room with its pristine furniture and carefully chosen artwork. The dining room where they entertained Thomas's business associates with increasingly successful results. The library where Thomas spent his evenings reading not just commercial reports, but philosophy and literature, surprising her again and again with the breadth of his education. It was a beautiful house, comfortable and elegant. Yet it felt temporary somehow, as though she were staying in a very fine hotel rather than making a home. Perhaps it was because everything had been chosen for her rather than by her. Thomas had consulted her wishes, but the fundamental decisions had been made before their marriage, creating a space designed to house the wife he hoped to win rather than the woman he had actually married. The afternoon brought Margaret's promised visit, along with her usual explosion of energy and affection. Isabella, you look positively blooming. Marriage clearly agrees with you. Margaret swept into the drawing room like a cheerful whirlwind, her arms full of parcels and her face bright with enthusiasm. You are very kind, Margaret. Nonsense, I'm merely observant. And speaking of observations, I've brought some samples from Madame Rousseau's shop. Thomas mentioned you might need some new evening gowns for the season, and I couldn't resist helping you choose. Isabella watched as Margaret spread fabric samples and fashion plates across the sofa, chattering about colors and styles with infectious enthusiasm. It struck her that this was perhaps the first time since her marriage that someone had sought her opinion on something purely for her own pleasure, rather than for its social or commercial utility. This blue would be magnificent with your coloring, Margaret continued, and Thomas does so love to see you in blue. He mentioned once that it reminds him of your eyes. Did he? Isabella found herself asking, surprised by her own curiosity. Oh, yes, he's quite observant about such things. Much more so than most men, I think. He notices everything about you, how you take your tea, which books you prefer, the way you arrange flowers. Sometimes I think he's studying you like a scholar with a particularly fascinating text. The observation was unsettling. Isabella had been aware of Thomas's attention, but she had attributed it to politeness, or perhaps a desire to ensure his investment in their marriage paid appropriate dividends. The possibility that his interest might be more personal, more genuine, was something she had been determinedly ignoring. Margaret, she said carefully, what did Thomas tell you about our marriage? Before the wedding, I mean. Margaret's hands stilled on the fabric samples. What did you mean? I mean, did he speak of it as a business arrangement, a matter of mutual benefit? Margaret's expression grew thoughtful. Isabella, my brother has never done anything purely for business reasons that involved his heart. He might have framed the marriage in practical terms. Thomas is always practical, but she paused, studying Isabella's face. You do realize he's been in love with you since the moment he first saw you? The words hit Isabella like a physical blow. That's impossible. He barely knew me. Love doesn't always wait for acquaintance, you know. Sometimes it strikes like lightning. Margaret's voice was gentle but certain. I've never seen Thomas look at anyone the way he looks at you, as though you hung the moon and stars just for him. Isabella felt the careful walls she had built around her emotions beginning to tremble. But surely he must have known. That is, he must have understood that I was marrying him out of necessity rather than affection. Perhaps. But Thomas has always believed that love, real love, is worth waiting for, worth working for. Margaret reached across and touched Isabella's hand gently. The question is, my dear sister. What do you believe?" After Margaret departed, Isabella found herself standing once again at the drawing-room window, watching the London street scene with unseeing eyes. The conversation had shaken something loose inside her, some carefully maintained certainty about the nature of her marriage and her own feelings. When Thomas returned that evening, bearing a small bouquet of hothouse roses, "They reminded me of you," he said simply. Isabella found herself studying his face as he handed them to her. Was Margaret right? Was there love in those dark eyes, carefully hidden beneath courtesy and consideration? And if there was, what was she going to do about it? As they sat down to dinner, maintaining their usual polite conversation about the day's events, Isabella felt as though she were seeing her husband clearly for the first time. Not as the merchant's son who had married above his station, not as the means to her family's salvation, but as Thomas, a man who brought her flowers because they reminded him of her, who listened to her opinions with genuine interest, who looked at her as though she were something infinitely precious. The realization terrified her more than any creditor's threat ever had. Chapter 5. The First Crisis. The acrid smell of smoke still hung heavy in the March air as Isabella stepped down from the hired carriage onto the cobblestones outside what had been the Whitmore textile mill in Bermondsey. The scene before her was one of devastation. Blackened brick walls stood like broken teeth against the gray sky, while workers picked through the smoldering ruins with grim determination. The fire had started sometime after midnight, and by dawn, nearly half of the mill complex lay in ruins. Thomas stood in the center of it all, his usually immaculate appearance forgotten as he coordinated with fire brigade officers, spoke with distraught workers, and surveyed the damage with the focused intensity she had come to recognize as his response to crisis. His face was streaked with soot, his shirt sleeves rolled up despite the March chill, and Isabella noticed with a pang of something unexpected that his hands were cut from handling debris. "Mrs. Whitmore, you shouldn't be here," said Mr. Jameson, the mill foreman, hurrying toward her with obvious concern. "It's not safe, and certainly not proper for a lady." "Nonsense," Isabella replied firmly, lifting her skirts to navigate the debris-strewn courtyard. "If my husband is here, then this is where I should be as well." She had surprised herself by coming. When the message arrived at the townhouse at dawn, her first instinct had been to wait properly at home for news, but something concerned for Thomas, perhaps, or maybe just the restless energy that had plagued her since Margaret's revelations had compelled her to dress quickly and make her way to the mill. Thomas looked up at her approach, and, for a moment, his carefully controlled expression cracked, revealing something raw and vulnerable. "Isabella, you shouldn't have come. The smoke, the danger. Are you hurt?" she asked, noting the way he favored his left arm. "It's nothing. A beam fell when we were trying to save some of the machinery." He dismissed her concern with a wave of his injured hand. "But Isabella, this could ruin us." The stark honesty in his voice struck her like a physical blow. In the months of their marriage, Thomas had maintained an air of confident prosperity, never allowing her to see the full weight of his responsibilities or the precarious nature of even his substantial fortune. Now, surrounded by the wreckage of one of his primary sources of income, his usual composure had cracked. "How bad is it?" she asked quietly. "Bad enough." Thomas ran his uninjured hand through his hair, leaving further streaks of soot. This mill employed nearly 200 workers. The machinery alone was worth more than £10,000, and we had orders pending worth twice that. The insurance, he shook his head grimly. The insurance will cover perhaps half the actual loss, if we're fortunate. Isabella felt a chill that had nothing to do with the March wind. £10,000. The same sum that had secured her hand in marriage. The same sum that had saved her family from ruin. The irony was not lost on her that Thomas might now face the same financial catastrophe that had driven her to marry him. "What about the workers?" she asked, watching as families gathered at the mill gates, their faces etched with worry. "That's what concerns me most." Thomas's voice was heavy with responsibility. "Many of them have been with us for years, some since my father first opened this mill. They depend on their wages to feed their families, and now—" He gestured helplessly at the ruins. Isabella watched as a woman with 3 small children approached Thomas, hesitantly. Her husband, she explained in a voice thick with tears, had been injured trying to save equipment and was now bedridden. Without his wages, they would lose their lodgings within the week. To Isabella's amazement, Thomas reached into his own pocket and pressed coins into the woman's hands. "Not charity," he insisted, "but an advance on wages that would be due once they rebuilt." He did the same for several other families, though Isabella could see the strain it placed on his own resources. "You cannot personally support every family affected," she murmured to him during a brief moment when they stood apart from the crowd. "Can't I?" His jaw was set with stubborn determination. "These people trusted their livelihoods to my family's enterprise. They deserve better than to be cast aside because of one night's disaster." As the day wore on, Isabella found herself drawn into the crisis despite her lack of experience with such matters. She helped Margaret, who had arrived shortly after Isabella herself, organize temporary shelter for the displaced workers. She took notes as Thomas met with insurance representatives and potential creditors. Most surprisingly, she found herself suggesting solutions drawn from her aristocratic training in managing large estates and their dependent populations. "What if we approached Lord Hartwell?" she suggested during a brief respite when Thomas sat heavily on a makeshift chair, exhaustion evident in every line of his body. He mentioned at the Pembroke soiree that he was looking for investment opportunities. He might be willing to provide temporary funding for reconstruction. Thomas looked at her with surprise. "You would ask him for a loan? For a merchant's enterprise?" "I would ask him for an investment opportunity in a profitable venture," Isabella corrected. "There's a difference." That evening, as they returned to the townhouse in grim silence, Isabella noticed how Thomas's shoulders sagged with exhaustion and worry. The confident businessman she had married seemed diminished somehow, aged by the weight of responsibility and the uncertainty of their future. "Thomas," she said quietly as their carriage pulled up to their door, "we will rebuild, somehow." He turned to look at her, and in the lamplight she saw something that made her breath catch. Not just gratitude, but a kind of wondering relief. As though her simple words of support meant more to him than any financial solution could. "We?" he asked softly. Isabella realized what she had said, and for a moment the word hung between them like a bridge she had unconsciously built. "Yes," she said, surprising herself with her certainty. Over the following days, Isabella threw herself into the effort to salvage the Whitmore fortunes with an energy that surprised everyone, including herself. She wrote carefully worded letters to every member of society who had ever expressed interest in commercial investments. She organized a subscription among the ladies of her acquaintance to provide temporary relief for the workers' families, framing it not as charity but as a moral obligation of the privileged classes. Most remarkably, she found herself working side by side with Thomas late into the evenings, poring over accounts and correspondence, planning the reconstruction, coordinating with suppliers and creditors. She discovered that her aristocratic education in managing complex social relationships translated surprisingly well to commercial negotiations. "You have a remarkable head for business," Thomas observed one evening as they reviewed the day's correspondence in his study. The intimacy of working together in the lamplight, surrounded by papers and plans, felt more natural than any of their formal drawing-room conversations. "I'm merely applying what I learned managing estate affairs at Pemberton Hall," Isabella replied, though she was secretly pleased by his approval. The principles are not so different. No, Thomas agreed, looking at her with an expression of growing respect. I suppose they're not. It was during one of these late-night planning sessions that Isabella finally allowed herself to acknowledge what she had been trying to ignore for weeks. As she watched Thomas explain a complex financial arrangement, noting the passion in his voice as he spoke of providing secure employment for his workers, she realized that somewhere along the way, her feelings had shifted fundamentally. This was not the calculating merchant she had imagined herself marrying. This was a man of genuine integrity, who cared more about his responsibilities to others than his own comfort, who looked at her not as a stepping stone to respectability, but as a true partner worthy of his trust and confidence. When he looked up and caught her staring, Isabella felt color rise in her cheeks. "What is it?" he asked gently. "Nothing," she said quickly, returning her attention to the papers before her. But even as she spoke, she knew it was everything. Everything had changed, and she was no longer certain she wanted to change it back. Chapter 6. Unexpected Depths. The autumn rain drummed steadily against the windows of the Whitmore townhouse as Isabella made her way to Thomas's private study, carrying a tea tray, a small courtesy that had become habit during the long evenings they now spent working together on the mill reconstruction. The past 6 months had transformed their marriage from a polite arrangement into something resembling a genuine partnership, though Isabella still maintained careful guard over her deeper feelings. She paused at the study door, surprised to find it slightly ajar and the room apparently empty. The fire crackled in the grate, and papers were scattered across Thomas's desk in his characteristically organized chaos, but he was nowhere to be seen. As she stepped inside to set down the tea tray, her attention was caught by the floor-to-ceiling bookshelves that lined the far wall shelves she had never examined closely during their business discussions. Setting the tray aside, Isabella moved closer to examine the volumes, expecting to find the usual collection of commercial texts and financial reports. Instead, she discovered an extraordinary library that spoke of a mind far more complex than she had imagined. Leather-bound volumes of Wordsworth and Byron sat beside philosophical treatises by John Stuart Mill and Jeremy Bentham. Greek classics in their original language neighbored translations of German philosophy, while political economy texts by Adam Smith shared space with the latest novels by Dickens and Thackeray. She pulled down a volume of Keats, noting the marginalia in Thomas's careful handwriting, thoughtful annotations that revealed not just literacy, but genuine engagement with the poet's ideas about beauty and truth. Another book, a treatise on social reform, bore evidence of intensive study, with passages marked and cross-referenced in a scholarly manner that would have impressed her Oxford-educated father. "I hope you don't mind the intrusion into my private retreat." Isabella spun around, startled, to find Thomas standing in the doorway with an expression that mingled embarrassment with something that might have been vulnerability. His usually immaculate appearance was slightly disheveled, his hair damp from the rain, and he carried several books under his arm. "I was bringing tea," she said, feeling somehow caught in an act of trespass. "I didn't realize, that is, I hadn't expected, that a merchant's son might own books beyond ledgers and price lists." There was no accusation in his voice, only a gentle understanding that made Isabella's cheeks burn with shame at her assumptions. "Forgive me," she said quietly. "I have been prejudiced in my thinking." Thomas set his books on the desk and moved to tend the fire, his movements careful and deliberate. "My father insisted on the finest education for me, despite our origins. Cambridge, the Grand Tour, private tutors in languages and philosophy. He believed that if the Whitmore name was to rise in the world, it must be through more than mere accumulation of wealth." Isabella watched him as he spoke, noting the way the firelight played across his features, highlighting the intelligence in his dark eyes. "And yet, you chose to follow him into commerce rather than pursue a scholarly life. "Scholarship is a luxury for those born to it," Thomas replied, settling into his chair behind the desk. "I had responsibilities to the family business, to our workers, to the future I hoped to build." He paused, glancing at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Besides, there are different kinds of education. These past months, working with you, watching how you navigate the complexities of society and business, I've learned more about true wisdom than any university could teach." The compliment was unexpected and deeply felt, delivered without the polished charm she might have expected, but with a sincerity that made her pulse quicken. Isabella found herself moving closer to the desk, drawn by something in his manner she had never noticed before. "What are you reading now?" she asked, gesturing to the books he had brought in. "Mill's latest essay on the subjection of women," Thomas replied, then seemed to catch himself. "Perhaps not a subject you would find. That is, I wouldn't wish to bore you with political philosophy." "On the contrary," Isabella said, surprising herself with her vehemence. "I find Mr. Mill's arguments quite compelling, though I confess I've had little opportunity to discuss them with anyone who might appreciate their implications." Thomas's eyes lit with genuine interest. "You've read Mill's work?" "My father, for all his faults, believed in educating daughters as well as sons. I've read Mill and Wollstonecraft and most of the modern political economists." Isabella settled into the chair across from his desk, feeling suddenly animated. "Though I must say Mill's arguments about marriage as a legal partnership rather than female subjugation seem particularly relevant to current social changes." What followed was unlike any conversation Isabella had ever had with a man. Thomas engaged with her ideas not with the patronizing indulgence she had experienced from other gentlemen, but with genuine intellectual respect. They debated the merits of social reform, the responsibilities of wealth, the changing nature of commerce and industry. When Isabella argued that the aristocracy's failure to adapt to modern economic realities had contributed to their own decline, Thomas listened with focused attention rather than dismissing her observations as inappropriate for a lady. "You have a remarkable mind," he said eventually, as the clock chimed 10 and the fire burned low in the grate. "I confess, I had hoped, that is, I had wondered if we might find such common ground, but I hardly dared expect—" "Expect what?" Isabella asked, leaning forward slightly. "Expect that you might see me as something more than a necessary convenience." The words were spoken quietly, almost hesitantly, but with an underlying honesty that made Isabella's breath catch. Before she could respond, they were interrupted by the arrival of unexpected guests. Voices in the entrance hall announced the Ashfords, come to call despite the lateness of the hour and the inclement weather. As Thomas rose to greet them, Isabella caught a glimpse of disappointment in his expression that matched her own. The Ashfords brought news and an invitation to a dinner party the following week, one that would include several prominent members of Parliament and their wives. As Lady Ashford detailed the guest list, Isabella noticed Lord Ashford making a comment about merchant sensibilities to another guest who had arrived with them. "Of course, one must make allowances," Lord Ashford was saying with the casual cruelty of a man secure in his own position. "Commerce is necessary, naturally, but one can hardly expect the same refinement from those engaged in trade, regardless of their financial success." Isabella felt her temper flare with an intensity that surprised her. Without thinking, she stepped forward. "I must disagree, Lord Ashford," she said with cool authority. "In my experience, those who have built their success through intelligence and industry often display far more genuine refinement than those who merely inherited their positions. True cultivation comes from the mind and character, not from the accident of birth." The room fell silent, and Isabella was acutely aware that she had just publicly defended her husband in a way that went far beyond mere wifely loyalty. Lord Ashford looked taken aback, while Lady Ashford's eyebrows rose in surprise. Thomas said nothing, but when Isabella glanced at him, She saw something in his expression that made her heart race. Gratitude? Certainly, but also something deeper and more complex. After the guests departed, Isabella and Thomas found themselves alone in the entrance hall, the weight of what had just occurred hanging between them like a bridge. Neither was certain they should cross. "You didn't need to defend me," Thomas said softly. "Yes," Isabella replied, meeting his gaze directly. "I did." That night, as Isabella prepared for bed, she found herself thinking not about the social implications of her public support for Thomas, but about the man who read philosophy by firelight and engaged with her ideas as though they mattered. The man who had looked at her with such wonder when she stood up for him, as though her good opinion was worth more than all the social connections she could provide. For the first time since their marriage, Isabella admitted to herself what she had been trying to deny for months. She was falling in love with her husband, not with his prosperity or his position, but with Thomas himself, his intelligence, his integrity, his quiet strength, and the way he saw her not as a prize to be won, but as a partner to be cherished. The realization terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure, because if she was falling in love with Thomas Whitmore, then everything about their carefully constructed arrangement would have to change, and she was no longer certain she could control the direction of that change. Chapter 7. The Transformation. The bitter December wind rattled the windows of Pemberton Hall as Isabella stood in what had once been her father's study, reading the letter that would change everything. The familiar handwriting of their family solicitor bore news that struck her like a physical blow. Despite Thomas's ongoing financial assistance, the estate faced immediate foreclosure. Hidden debts, predatory creditors, and legal complications her father had never disclosed now threatened to strip away even the pretense of salvation her marriage had provided. "My lady," Mary, her maid, peered anxiously around the door. "The master is asking for you in the library." Isabella folded the letter carefully, her hands steady despite the turmoil in her chest. She had come to Pemberton Hall for what she thought would be a brief visit to oversee some repairs. Now she wondered if she would ever see her ancestral home again. She found Thomas in the library, standing before the tall windows that overlooked the winter garden. He turned as she entered, and she was struck by the gravity in his expression, the careful control that suggested he bore news as weighty as her own. "You received Blackwood's letter," he said. It was not a question. Isabella felt her composure waver. "You knew? I've been corresponding with him for weeks." Thomas moved toward her, his steps measured and deliberate. "Isabella, there are things about your family's debts that you were never told, obligations your father concealed even from your mother." The gentle concern in his voice nearly undid her. "How much?" "More than we initially understood. Your father borrowed against debts that were already secured against other debts. It's a maze of legal complications that makes the situation far more precarious than anyone realized." Thomas ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration she had learned to recognize. "I've been making payments to the most pressing creditors, buying time while the mill reconstruction progresses. But, Isabella prompted, though she dreaded the answer. "But it's not sustainable indefinitely. I've invested everything I can spare without jeopardizing the business itself. If the mill reconstruction succeeds as we hope, if the new contracts materialize, then in perhaps 2 or 3 years, I might be able to settle your father's debts entirely." Thomas's voice grew quieter. "But if something goes wrong, if the business fails to recover fully, then we lose everything," Isabella finished. "The estate, your investment, all of it." "The estate, yes, but not everything." Thomas studied her face with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "Isabella, I need you to understand something. I've made these investments knowing full well the risk involved. This isn't some calculated business venture." Isabella felt her heart begin to race. "Then what is it?" "It's love," he said simply. "I've been pouring money into saving your family's estate, not because our marriage agreement requires it, but because I cannot bear to see you lose something that matters to you. Because your happiness is worth more to me than financial security." The words struck her like lightning. "That's impossible. The amount you've risked, the danger to your own fortune, is nothing compared to seeing you smile when you speak of this place. Nothing compared to the privilege of calling you my wife." Thomas moved closer, his dark eyes intense with feeling. "Isabella, I need you to understand something else. If the worst happens, if the business cannot recover enough to save the estate, our original marriage agreement becomes void. You would be free to seek an annulment, to return to society as Lady Isabella Pemberton, unburdened by a failed merchant's debts." Isabella stared at him, the full implications of his words sinking in like cold water. "You would release me from our marriage? If that's what you wanted." Thomas's voice was steady, but she could see the cost of making such an offer. "If you stayed only because of our arrangement, because you felt obligated, I could not live with that. I would rather lose you entirely than keep you through obligation alone." The question that had been haunting Isabella for months suddenly crystallized with perfect clarity. Not whether she could fulfill her duty as Thomas's wife, but whether she wanted to. Not whether their marriage served her family's interests, but whether it served her heart. She thought of the evenings they had spent working together in his study, the way he challenged her intellectually and treated her opinions with genuine respect. She remembered his kindness to the mill workers, his integrity in business dealings, the way he looked at her not as a prize won, but as a woman worthy of devotion. Most of all, she thought of how empty the house felt when he was away, how she had come to treasure their conversations, how defending him to Lord Ashford had felt not like duty, but like protecting something precious. "Thomas," she said quietly, moving to stand directly before him, "if the estate is lost, if our marriage agreement becomes meaningless, if I have nothing left to offer you but myself." She saw hope and fear warring in his expression as he waited for her to continue. "I would choose to stay," she said, her voice growing stronger with conviction. "Not out of obligation or gratitude, but because, somewhere in these months of discovering who you truly are, I have fallen quite desperately in love with you." The transformation in Thomas's expression was like watching the sun rise. He reached for her hands with trembling fingers. "Isabella," he breathed, "do you mean it?" "I mean it," she whispered. "I love your integrity, your intelligence, your kindness. I love the way you treat me as an equal partner rather than an ornament. I love that you would risk everything for my happiness, even knowing I might not return your feelings." She took a shaky breath. "And I love that you would set me free rather than keep me through obligation, even though it would break your heart." "It would," he admitted, his voice rough with emotion. "But your happiness matters more to me than my own." "Then you should know," Isabella said, reaching up to touch his face, "that my happiness lies with you. Whatever comes, success or failure, wealth or poverty, I want to face it as your wife in truth, not just in name." Thomas pulled her into his arms then, holding her as though she were something infinitely precious. "I love you," he said against her hair. "I have loved you from the moment I first saw you, and I will love you until my dying breath." "And I love you," Isabella replied, marveling at how natural the words felt now that she had finally allowed herself to speak them. "Whatever the future holds, we will meet it together." When they finally drew apart, both breathing unsteadily, Thomas cupped her face in his hands. "Are you certain? If the business fails, you would be giving up any chance of returning to your old life?" Isabella smiled, feeling truly free for the first time since her father's troubles began. "My old life was built on appearances and obligations. This life, our life, is built on something far more valuable. "And what is that?" "Love," she said simply, "and that is worth any risk." Outside, the December wind continued to howl around Pemberton Hall, but inside the library, two people who had married as strangers discovered that they had somehow, against all odds, found their way to the most precious thing of all, a love freely given and joyfully received. Chapter 8. Love Acknowledged. Spring arrived at the Whitmore townhouse like a benediction, filling the rooms with golden light and the sweet scent of cherry blossoms from the garden. Their financial troubles solved, Isabella stood at the drawing-room window, watching Thomas's carriage approach through the busy London street, and felt her heart lift with the same joy that had become her constant companion these past 3 months since their declaration of love at Pemberton Hall. Everything had changed between them, yet in many ways everything remained the same. They still worked together in the evenings, but now their discussions were punctuated by gentle touches and stolen kisses. They still entertained business associates and society connections, but now Isabella felt genuine pride in introducing Thomas rather than performing a dutiful role. Most remarkably, she had discovered that love enhanced rather than diminished her capabilities, her social skills, her business acumen, her ability to navigate the complex world they inhabited together. "Mrs. Whitmore?" Mrs. Patterson appeared in the doorway with her usual quiet efficiency. "There's a caller waiting in the morning room, Lady Pembroke, and she's brought a young gentleman with her." Isabella's eyebrows rose in surprise. Lady Pembroke's visits had become more frequent since Isabella's public defense of Thomas at Lord Ashford's dinner, as though the older woman was reassessing her opinion of the Whitmore marriage. But bringing an unknown gentleman was unusual. She found Lady Pembroke examining the latest addition to their art collection, a portrait of Thomas that Isabella had commissioned as a surprise for his birthday, painted by the same artist who had done her wedding portrait. "Lady Pembroke, what an unexpected pleasure." Isabella curtsied gracefully, noting that the older woman's companion was a well-dressed gentleman of perhaps 40, with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. "My dear Mrs. Whitmore, you look positively radiant. Marriage continues to agree with you, I see." Lady Pembroke's smile held genuine warmth now, a far cry from her early calculating assessments. "May I present Mr. Henry Caldwell of the Board of Trade? He has expressed particular interest in meeting you and your husband." Mr. Caldwell bowed with official precision. "Mrs. Whitmore, your reputation for intelligent conversation precedes you. I understand you've been instrumental in several successful business ventures of late." Isabella felt a flutter of curiosity. "You flatter me, Mr. Caldwell. I merely assist my husband in small ways." "On the contrary," Lady Pembroke interjected, "Lord Ashford was quite impressed by your suggestions regarding his shipping investments, and the charitable subscription you organized for the mill workers has been spoken of favorably in the highest circles." Before Isabella could respond, Thomas's voice carried from the entrance hall as he greeted Mrs. Patterson. Within moments, he appeared in the doorway, his face lighting with the warm smile that had become Isabella's favorite sight in all the world. "Lady Pembroke, Mr. Caldwell." Thomas bowed to their guests before moving to Isabella's side with the natural ease of a man secure in his wife's affections. "To what do we owe this pleasure?" "Actually, Mr. Whitmore, it is I who requested this introduction," Mr. Caldwell said, his manner becoming more formal. "I have been following your business practices with considerable interest, particularly your innovative approaches to worker welfare and industrial efficiency." Thomas's hand found Isabella's, a gesture of unconscious support that warmed her heart. "Our approaches have been developed in partnership, Mr. Caldwell. My wife's insights have been invaluable." "Indeed, that is precisely what I hoped to hear." Mr. Caldwell's expression grew more serious. "The Board of Trade has been tasked with identifying progressive industrial leaders who might advise on new legislation regarding working conditions and commercial practices. Your mill's reputation for fair wages and safe working conditions combined with its remarkable productivity, has drawn considerable attention. Isabella felt Thomas's surprise in the slight tension of his fingers around hers. "I'm honored by such attention, sir, though I confess myself puzzled as to what this might entail. The government is particularly interested in industrial leaders who understand that social responsibility and commercial success can work hand in hand," Mr. Caldwell explained. "Men who recognize that the welfare of workers ultimately benefits the entire enterprise. And women," Lady Pembroke added pointedly, "who can bridge the gap between traditional society and modern commerce. The combination of commercial acumen and social influence is becoming increasingly valuable." Isabella found herself exchanging a meaningful glance with Thomas. Their partnership, born of necessity and nurtured by love, had apparently created something that transcended their original expectations. "What exactly are you proposing, Mr. Caldwell?" Thomas asked directly. "That you consider serving on a new government commission examining industrial reform. The position would involve consulting on legislation, advising on policy, and serving as a liaison between the business community and Parliament." Mr. Caldwell paused significantly. "It would also come with certain recognitions of your service to the Crown." The implication hung in the air like a promise. Isabella felt her pulse quicken, not from ambition, but from pride in what Thomas had accomplished through his own merit. After their guests departed with promises to continue the conversation, Isabella and Thomas found themselves alone in the drawing room, the afternoon light casting long shadows across the polished floors. "Government service," Thomas said quietly, still seeming to absorb the conversation. "Recognition from the Crown. When I married you, I hoped your connections might open a few business opportunities. I never imagined that your own character and accomplishments might earn recognition in their own right." Isabella moved to stand before him, reaching up to straighten his cravat with the intimate gesture of a wife, secure in her husband's love. "Thomas, what Mr. Caldwell described isn't about my family connections. It's about what you've built, what we've built together." "We," Thomas repeated, catching her hands and bringing them to his lips. "Yes, we have built something remarkable, haven't we?" Isabella smiled, thinking of the mill workers who no longer feared for their livelihoods, the innovative safety measures they had implemented together, the way their marriage had become a model of partnership that transcended social boundaries. "We have, chérie, and not just in business, in every way that matters." That evening, as they worked together in Thomas's study, their study now, really, since Isabella had claimed half the desk space for her own correspondence and projects, she marveled at how completely their lives had intertwined. The ledgers and letters scattered across the desk represented not just Thomas's commercial interests, but their shared vision of what business could accomplish when guided by both profit and principle. "Isabella," Thomas said suddenly, looking up from a contract he was reviewing, "are you happy?" The question was asked with the vulnerability of a man who still couldn't quite believe his good fortune, despite months of evidence to the contrary. "Happier than I ever imagined possible," she replied honestly. "Are you?" "Beyond my wildest dreams." Thomas set aside his papers and moved around the desk to where she sat, pulling her to her feet and into his arms. "When I first saw you at Pemberton Hall, I thought you were the most beautiful woman I had ever encountered. But I never dared hope that beneath that beauty lay a mind and heart that would complement my own so perfectly." Isabella reached up to touch his face, still amazed by the freedom to do so. "When I agreed to marry you, I thought I was sacrificing everything for duty. Instead, I discovered that love, real love, doesn't diminish you. It makes you more than you ever thought possible." "Then you don't regret it? Any of it? The scandal of marrying beneath your station, the gossip, the way some of society still whispers about us?" Isabella laughed, the sound bright with genuine amusement. "Beneath my station? Thomas, look what we've accomplished together. You're being considered for government service based on your own merits. We've created a business that serves as a model for others. We've shown that partnership between equals can achieve more than either could alone." She paused, her expression growing tender. "Besides, I've learned something important about stations in life." "What's that?" "The only station that truly matters is the one you earn through your choices, your character, and your actions. And by that measure, Mr. Thomas Whitmore, you outrank every peer in England." As Thomas kissed her with all the passion and tenderness their love had grown to encompass, Isabella reflected on the unexpected journey that had brought them to this moment. She had entered marriage as a transaction and discovered it could be a transformation. She had married a merchant's son and found a man whose worth transcended any title. Outside their study windows, London continued its busy commerce, unaware that within one townhouse in Belgravia, two people had discovered that the greatest fortune of all was love freely given and gratefully received. Chapter 9. Recognition and Trials. The summer of 1848 brought both triumph and crisis to London, and the Whitmores found themselves at the center of both. The cholera outbreak that swept through the city's poorer districts struck with devastating swiftness, claiming lives and spreading panic through every level of society. It was during this crisis that Thomas and Isabella's partnership would face its greatest test and earn its greatest recognition. Isabella stood in the makeshift relief station they had established in one of the empty mill buildings, coordinating the distribution of clean water and medical supplies with the methodical efficiency she had once applied to managing Pemberton Hall. Her morning dress had been replaced by a practical dark wool gown, and her hands, once soft from a life of leisure, now bore the calluses of honest work. "Mrs. Whitmore, the doctors are requesting more carbolic acid for the temporary hospital," called Margaret, who had thrown herself into the relief efforts with characteristic enthusiasm. The younger woman's face was pale with exhaustion, but her determination remained unshaken. "Tell them it will arrive within the hour," Isabella replied, checking her carefully maintained lists. The shipment from Liverpool should be at the docks by now. Thomas had mobilized his entire shipping network to bring supplies to the affected areas, coordinating with merchants across the country in an unprecedented display of commercial cooperation. His ability to organize complex logistical operations had proven invaluable in combating the epidemic, while Isabella's social connections had opened doors that would have remained closed to a merchant's entreaties alone. "Isabella." Thomas appeared at her elbow, his face grim with the weight of the news he bore. "I've just received word from Whitehall. Prince Albert wishes to inspect our relief operations personally." Isabella felt her pulse quicken. Prince Albert's interest in industrial and social reform was well known, but a personal visit during such a crisis would bring both opportunity and scrutiny that could shape their future dramatically. "When?" she asked, automatically beginning to calculate what would need to be reorganized for such an inspection. "This afternoon. He's touring the affected districts and wants to see how private enterprise is supporting the government's efforts." Thomas's voice carried a mixture of pride and apprehension. "Caldwell mentioned that our work here has drawn considerable attention at the highest levels." The afternoon inspection proved to be a revelation. Prince Albert arrived with a small entourage, his serious demeanor reflecting the gravity of the crisis. But Isabella could see his genuine interest as Thomas explained their relief operations. The prince listened intently as Thomas described how they had converted mill buildings into treatment centers, organized supply chains from across the country, and coordinated with local physicians to maximize their effectiveness. "And Mrs. Whitmore," Prince Albert said, turning his attention to Isabella with the courtesy that marked his interactions with all women of quality, "I understand you have been instrumental in organizing the volunteer efforts?" "I have had the privilege of coordinating among the ladies of society, Your Royal Highness," Isabella replied with appropriate modesty. "We have found that combining traditional charitable efforts with more systematic business methods produces remarkable results." "Indeed?" The prince's eyebrows rose with interest. "Can you elaborate?" Isabella felt Thomas's encouraging presence beside her as she explained how they had applied commercial principles to charitable work, tracking supplies, measuring outcomes, coordinating efforts across multiple organizations to eliminate duplication and maximize impact. It was, she realized as she spoke, a perfect synthesis of her aristocratic training in managing complex social relationships and the business acumen she had learned working beside Thomas. "Fascinating," Prince Albert murmured. "You have essentially created a new model for private charitable enterprise, one that combines the efficiency of commerce with the moral imperative of social responsibility." After the prince departed with promises to continue observing their work, Isabella and Thomas found themselves standing together in the empty mill courtyard as evening shadows lengthened around them. "I believe," Thomas said quietly, "that we may have just changed our lives rather dramatically." Before Isabella could respond, a messenger arrived with urgent news that would test them in ways they had never anticipated. The cholera outbreak had reached Yorkshire, and among its victims was Isabella's father, Lord Edmund Pemberton. The journey to Pemberton Hall was undertaken in grim silence, both Isabella and Thomas understanding that they were traveling toward the end of an era. When they arrived, they found Lady Catherine maintaining her dignity despite obvious grief, while the estate itself seemed to echo with finality. "He spoke of you both at the end," Lady Catherine told them as they sat in the familiar drawing room where Isabella had first agreed to marry Thomas. He said he had been wrong about many things, but that your marriage was perhaps the one decision that had turned out better than he deserved." Isabella felt tears threatening as she absorbed the loss of the complicated man who had been her father, flawed and ultimately defeated by his own weaknesses, but still the connection to her childhood and her heritage. "Mama," she said gently, "what will you do now?" "The estate must be sold," Lady Catherine replied with the matter-of-fact acceptance of someone who had already grieved for that loss. "The debts, well, they are what they are, but Mr. Whitmore's generous support has at least ensured that I will not be left destitute." Thomas leaned forward earnestly. "Lady Catherine, please understand that our support will continue regardless of the estate's fate. You are family now." Isabella felt a surge of love for her husband at his unhesitating inclusion of her mother in their circle of protection. It was, she realized, exactly what she would have expected from the man she had come to know so well. But the estate's situation proved more complicated than even they had anticipated. Unknown creditors emerged from the shadows, claiming liens and debts that predated Thomas's involvement. Distant relatives appeared to contest the will, arguing that the property should remain within the traditional bloodline rather than being sold to satisfy commercial debts. "It's become a legal morass," their solicitor explained during a tense meeting in London. "The competing claims could tie up the courts for years." As if the estate troubles were not enough, Thomas received disturbing news about their business interests. A competitor, apparently resentful of the Whitmores' growing influence and government recognition, had begun spreading rumors about the financial stability of their enterprises. Whispers suggested that Thomas had overextended himself supporting both the cholera relief efforts and the Pemberton debts, that his businesses were built on unsustainable charitable impulses rather than sound commercial principles. "The rumors are affecting our credit," Thomas admitted to Isabella one evening as they reviewed the increasingly troubling reports. "Several banks have requested additional guarantees for loans that were previously routine. If confidence in our stability continues to erode," Isabella understood the implications without his having to spell them out. If their business collapsed, not only would they lose their own security, but the workers who depended on them would suffer. Lady Catherine would be left vulnerable, and all their efforts at social reform would be discredited. "What do we need to do?" she asked simply. Thomas looked at her with the expression of grateful amazement that had become familiar whenever she demonstrated her complete commitment to their partnership. We need to fight for everything we've built. But Isabella, if we fail, we won't fail, she said with quiet conviction. Whatever comes, we'll face it together. And if the worst happens, we'll begin again, together. As they prepared for what might prove to be the greatest challenge of their marriage, Isabella reflected on how far they had traveled from the desperate arrangement that had brought them together. They had built something worth fighting for, not just their personal happiness, but a model of partnership that challenged traditional boundaries and offered hope for a more equitable future. Now they would discover whether love and partnership were strong enough to survive the storms that threatened to destroy everything they had worked to create. Chapter 10. Triumph and Title. The courtroom in Lincoln's Inn was packed to capacity on that crisp October morning in 1848, as lawyers, creditors, distant relatives, and curious members of society gathered to witness what had become known as the Pemberton case. Isabella sat beside Thomas in the front row, her hand steady in his as they listened to the final arguments that would determine the fate of her family's ancestral estate. Their barrister, Mr. Edmund Hartwell, a brilliant legal mind whom Thomas had engaged at considerable expense, was presenting their case with methodical precision. The crux of his argument was elegant in its simplicity. Thomas's ongoing financial support had been given in good faith based on full disclosure as it was understood at the time. The subsequently discovered debts and competing claims could not invalidate the original agreement or the legitimate investments made under its terms. "My lords," Mr. Hartwell addressed the panel of judges, "Mr. Whitmore's support of the Pemberton estate was not merely a commercial transaction, but an act of good faith that has preserved the property and provided for its dependents. To allow hidden creditors and distant claimants to benefit from his generosity would set a dangerous precedent that would discourage such charitable enterprises in future." Isabella felt Thomas's fingers tighten around hers as the opposing counsel rose to present their counter-argument. But she was no longer the frightened young woman who had once feared the loss of her heritage above all else. These months of partnership with Thomas, of building something new and valuable together, had taught her that legacy was not about preserving the past unchanged, but about creating something worthy of the future. The judges retired to deliberate, and the waiting began. Thomas and Isabella walked together through the quiet corridors of the inn, speaking little but drawing strength from each other's presence. "Whatever they decide," Isabella said as they paused before a window overlooking the gardens, "we have won something more valuable than any estate." "Have we?" Thomas asked, though his tone suggested he knew her meaning. "We have proven that a marriage based on love and mutual respect can weather any storm. We have shown that partnership between equals creates something stronger than either could achieve alone." Isabella turned to face him fully. "Thomas, even if we lose Pemberton Hall, even if we lose everything, we have each other, and that is worth more than all the ancestral estates in England." Their moment of quiet reflection was interrupted by a commotion in the corridor. A messenger had arrived bearing the royal seal, and he was asking specifically for Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore. "By order of His Royal Highness Prince Albert," the messenger announced formally, "Mr. Thomas Whitmore and Mrs. Isabella Whitmore are commanded to attend upon Her Majesty at Buckingham Palace at 2 o'clock this afternoon." Thomas and Isabella exchanged glances of surprise and trepidation. A royal summons during the midst of their legal troubles could hardly be considered fortuitous timing. But when they returned to the courtroom, they discovered that fortune had taken an unexpected turn. The judges had reached their decision with remarkable swiftness, and it was more favorable than they had dared hope. "It is the judgment of this court," the chief judge announced, "that Mr. Whitmore's good faith investments in the Pemberton estate constitute a legitimate claim that takes precedence over subsequently discovered obligations. Furthermore, the court recognizes that Mr. Whitmore's support has preserved the estate's value for all parties involved." The legal victory meant that Thomas's investments were secure and that Lady Catherine would be provided for. But more importantly, It vindicated their approach to the crisis. They had acted with integrity and transparency, and the law had recognized that such behavior deserved protection. The afternoon audience at Buckingham Palace proved even more momentous than the legal victory. Isabella and Thomas were received in the blue drawing room, where Prince Albert awaited them with an expression of grave ceremony. "Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore," the prince began, "your response to the recent cholera outbreak has been observed with great interest by Her Majesty and myself. Your innovative approach to charitable relief, combining commercial efficiency with social responsibility, represents precisely the kind of progressive thinking that our nation requires." Isabella felt her heart racing as Prince Albert continued, but she maintained the composed demeanor that years of aristocratic training had instilled in her. "Furthermore," the prince said, his voice taking on additional formality, "your demonstration that partnership between different sectors of society can achieve remarkable results has not gone unnoticed. Mr. Whitmore, it is Her Majesty's pleasure to offer you a knighthood in recognition of your services to the Crown and to the people of England." The words seemed to echo in the elegant room as their full meaning sank in. Thomas, the merchant's son who had married above his station, was being offered a title based on his own merit and achievements. "Your Royal Highness," Thomas said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment, "I am deeply honored by Her Majesty's recognition, but I must say that any success I have achieved has been accomplished in partnership with my wife. Her contributions have been equal to my own." Prince Albert's expression showed approval at Thomas's response. "Indeed, Mr. Whitmore, it is precisely that understanding of true partnership that makes you worthy of this honor. Lady Isabella, your role in demonstrating how traditional social leadership can adapt to serve modern needs has been equally valuable." As they left Buckingham Palace, Isabella felt as though she were walking in a dream. Sir Thomas Whitmore and Lady Isabella Whitmore titles earned not through inheritance, but through service, love, and dedication to something greater than themselves. "Can you believe it?" Thomas asked, as their carriage made its way through London's busy streets. "I can believe it," Isabella replied, taking his hand in both of hers, "because I have come to understand that true nobility comes from character, not bloodline. You have always been worthy of such recognition, Thomas. The Crown has simply acknowledged what I learned to see months ago." That evening, as they sat together in their study, their sanctuary, where so many of their plans had been made and their partnership had deepened, Thomas raised a glass of champagne to toast their extraordinary day. "To partnerships that transform us," he said. "To love that makes us worthy of transformation," Isabella replied. As they drank, Isabella reflected on the remarkable journey that had brought them to this moment. She had entered marriage as Lady Isabella Pemberton, a desperate young woman sacrificing herself for her family's salvation. She was ending the day as Lady Isabella Whitmore, wife to a knight of the realm, partner in enterprises that served both profit and principle, and most importantly, a woman who had discovered that love, real, transformative love, was worth any sacrifice. "Do you ever regret it?" Thomas asked softly, seeming to read her thoughts. "The life you might have had if circumstances had been different?" Isabella smiled, thinking of the cold, calculating woman she had once been, driven by duty and desperate necessity. "I regret nothing," she said with absolute certainty. "That life would have been empty compared to this one. I would rather be Lady Isabella Whitmore, partner to a knight earned through merit, than Lady Isabella anyone, married for convenience. Even though I was beneath your station when we married?" "Thomas," Isabella said, rising to move into his arms, "you were never beneath my station. I was simply too blind to see how far above it you truly were." As they held each other in the firelight, surrounded by the books and papers that represented their shared work and dreams, Isabella marveled at how completely her life had been transformed. She had gained not just a husband, but a true partner. Not just security, but purpose. Not just duty, but love in its fullest and most joyous form. The news of Thomas's knighthood had spread through London's commercial circles with remarkable speed, and its effects were already being felt. The competitor who had spread malicious rumors about the Whitmore enterprises found his schemes crumbling as investors and partners rushed to associate themselves with the newly knighted Sir Thomas. Banks that had demanded additional guarantees now competed to offer favorable terms, and the whispers of financial instability were replaced by acclaim for visionary leadership. The royal recognition had not only validated their approach to business and social responsibility, but had thoroughly discredited those who had sought to undermine them through jealousy and spite. Outside their window, London continued its restless activity, unaware that within one house in Belgravia, two souls had discovered that the greatest fortune of all was a love that transformed both the giver and the receiver, creating something far greater than either could have achieved alone. Their story had begun with a desperate bargain and blossomed into a love story that would serve as a model for partnerships across the social boundaries of their changing world. And in years to come, Sir Thomas and Lady Isabella Whitmore would be remembered not just for their individual achievements, but for proving that when love and respect join forces, they can indeed conquer all.